So today we're going to talk about a very familiar passage of Scripture, Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. And we've talked about this in the past. It's tied to chapter 5, the end of it. And this was a household code that the Apostle Paul was writing to the church at Ephesus. And these were very common in the time of Paul. This was instructions on how families ought to function. And so we get to children. Now, what makes this so different is that in the normal household code, you would find really no mention of kids, and you would find really no mention of slaves, because they were to be seen, not heard. They weren't really a part. But for the church, the world is different, and we view things differently. We view the husband and wife relationship different. We view children different. We view slaves different. We view all these different players differently than the rest of the world does. And so we jump in here to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. He says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may be well with you, and that you may live long on the earth." Now, you've got to avoid a little temptation, moms. You have to avoid the temptation of either looking at your child in this room and saying, "See, I told you," or calling them up this afternoon and say, "See, I told you." You have to avoid that. And here's why you have to avoid that. There is one thing that every one of us have in common in this room. We all have a mama. All right? So your mama could call you up and say, "I told you." And so before we start that process of he said, she said, and finger pointing and all that kind of stuff, let's just remember that we're talking to all of us. So there is not a single person today who gets off the hook, if you will. This is going to be to every one of us. He says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." This is not a suggestion. This is not a "we hope so." This is a commandment. He says, "Children, obey your parents." This is your obligation. This is your duty. This is your responsibility. This is your job. Children, obey your parents. Now, let's talk about this word obey. We're not talking simply about do what I tell you. Because we've all met those kids, right? They do what their parents say, but they're not fulfilling this. And the reason why they're not fulfilling this is that tied to this word obey is this idea of respect. And so it might be easier, or it might even be better to say, "Children, respect your parents." Because if you're truly going to respect your parents, what are you going to do? You're going to do what they tell you. You're going to listen to them. You're going to obey them. So what he's trying to say is, children, respect your parents. Children, obey your parents. Children, do what your parents say. Why? Because this is your obligation. Because society says so? No. He says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord." This is your God-given responsibility to listen and obey and respect your parents. And that is so hard, isn't it? Right? Let's go ahead. Let's be honest. Because we all have went through that stage where our parents were complete idiots. Right? And then we've come through that and we look back and we say, maybe there was an idiot in the mix. Probably not mom and dad. Probably me. And then we think to ourselves, but, I'm going to do a better job with my kids, right? Anybody here have grown kids now that at some point looked at you and you remembered that look on their face? Without saying a word, you knew that they were sitting there looking at you thinking, "You're an idiot." Because you looked at your mama with that look. And so, this is all of us. I don't know why this is so hard, and we want... with 3 little kids, I look at them sometimes and I say, it'd just be so much easier if you would do what I told you to do. And it would be, wouldn't it? It'd be easier on me. It'd be easier on them. the world would all function the way it's supposed to. And then I stop and think, I wonder how many times God looks at me and says, Tommy Green, if you would just do what I told you to do. So we never grow out of it. We never grow out of it. None of us want to listen. All of us are bullheaded. All of us are stubborn. All of us want to do it our way. That's us. Every one of us. So he says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. This is the right thing to do. This is your responsibility. This is your obligation. And that becomes a challenge, doesn't it? Now, I look at my parents, and I won't say that my parents were perfect, and we'll even make it specifically my mom. I won't say my mom has been perfect. I think she loved me. I think she loved me unconditionally. I think she did her very best, but I don't think she was perfect. So it doesn't have anything to do with being perfect, does it? Here's what an author, her name is Linda Mental, or Mentley. She says this in her book, I Love My Mother, But honor is not about having a great childhood or about having a mom that got it all right. Honor is about gratitude and respect for the difficulty of the job. And that's one thing that teenagers, little kids, people who don't have kids of their own, they've not gone through, they've not reached that stage in their life yet. And mama and daddy is telling them, this is what you need to do, this is what you need to do. And they have no respect, no regard, all of those kinds of teenage issues they just can't grasp. Until you have the responsibility of this is my kid. And I have the opportunity to do well with their life, or I have the opportunity to screw it up. Right? When Ellie was born, the very first thing that popped into my head was all the opportunities I will have to mess up. Because you get a lot more opportunities to mess up than you do to get right. So it's not about saying I had the perfect mom. It's not about flowers. And it's not about chocolate. And it's not about Mother's Day cards. It's not about any of those things. Because let's just face it, there are some moms in this world who are not very good moms. And it's not that they didn't do a great job, it's that they did a pitiful job. Those moms exist. So how do you deal with those moms? Well, number one, you don't have to sweep it under the rug and act like the relationship is something that it's not. Because honoring doesn't have anything to do with touchy-feely hugs and kisses. It has everything to do with obedience and respect. And you say, I can respect you, even though we don't have this close relationship. That respect still has to be there. It still has to exist. We've just tied respect to the emotional aspects of our relationships. And the emotional side doesn't have to be there. Because sometimes that relationship just strained, right? Go ahead and shake your head. Sometimes the relationship is just strained. And it doesn't mean that it's always going to be that way, but it may mean that it's that way right now. A few weeks ago, fortunately my mom doesn't listen to this online, but a few weeks ago we were having a little issue inside the family because Chris and I are very busy. We have lots of things going on. And it's not always easy for us to take the 3-hour trip to go see my parents. And so a lot of times they'll come down here. So Mom, we were going up there for Chris's cousin's wedding. And we had already decided we're not going to take all the kids. Ellie's in the wedding. This is the weekend of Ellie's birthday. We're going to try to make this about Ellie as much as we can. We're going to leave the other kids at home. Well, my mom started in on this guilt trip. Now, you guys know what kind of relationship I have with my mom. It makes Chris nauseous most of the time. I hung up on my mom. I've never hung up on her before. And I was devastated after I hung up on her. But the next morning, we were able to hash everything out on why I did that. And I said, Mom, you can't put me on this guilt trip. You've got to understand I'm doing the best that I can. There was a few moments there in my relationship with my mom that it was not everything that it always is, and not everything I wanted it to be, and certainly not everything she wanted it to be. We just had some issues that we had to work through. So this isn't about always being touchy-feely and everything's great. This is reality. Reality is, he says, honor your mother and your father. Respect them. Obey them. He says this is the first commandment with a promise. Well, what does he mean when he says it's the first commandment with a promise? Because it's really not the first commandment with a promise if you read the Decalogue. You can kind of manipulate it a little bit and say, well, maybe this is not so much a promise as it is a description. So what does he mean? Well, in the world of the Pharisees, this commandment was number one. This was the most important commandment, according to the Pharisees. Honor your father and mother. That was it. That was number one. Now for us, what do we put number one? You have no other gods before me. Why do we make that number one? Because it's first in the list, right? I mean, we're good Western thinkers. If it's first in the list, it must be first in importance. Well, the Jewish world and the Jewish mind didn't think necessarily like that. The Pharisees said this is the most important commandment. Why would that be? What do you guys think? Let's talk. Why would this be the most important commandment? Even over, you shall have no other gods before me. I think there's a simple answer out there. It's not too complicated. Wouldn't be here. That's part of it. Mm-hmm. Who is responsible for teaching children? Mom and Dad. They didn't have Sunday school. It wasn't set up like this. We didn't pass off our educational responsibilities to someone else. Mom and Dad taught them. So if you're going to ever know you shall have no other gods before me, what's the first thing you're going to have to do? You're going to have to listen to your mom and dad. So that's that side of it, the educational side of it. Why else is it important to listen to our parents? What have our parents done? They've made mistakes, haven't they? A guy told me once, he said, the fool never learns from anyone's mistakes. A smart man learns from his own mistakes, but the wise man learns from mistakes of others. And so one of the responsibilities of a parent is to say to their children, here are the mistakes that I've made. You don't want to go down that path. And then children ought to be able to listen to those parents and say, I trust you. And I know that this sounds a whole lot easier than it is in real life, isn't it? In real life, this is hard. But it may not be any harder than the husband-wife relationship. And we work at that, don't we? And if we don't work at that, we know where that leads us. So I wonder sometimes, do we not work hard enough on our relationship with our kids? This trust-building relationship. And I used to hate it when I was a kid, and I catch myself doing it all the time. Ellie will look at me, I'll say, don't do that, and she will look at me and she will ask the question, why? And what is my answer? Because I said so. And typically every time I say that, not always, but typically every time I say that, after it comes out of my mouth, I think, you know what, I have just missed another opportunity to teach my little girl as to why you're not supposed to do that. And sometimes I do teach them that. I mean, most things around the Green household will lead to your death. That's what they think. You don't do that because you will die. If you do this, then you'll get killed. If you do this, a car will run over you and you'll have bleed. That's what I call it, blood. You'll have bleed all over you. So, but we have to take those opportunities to teach our children. For the children that we do have here, it can be hard sometimes to listen to that because I said so. Because you want to know why. Here's my advice to you guys. Your mom and dad are going to have your best interests at heart. They're not always going to make the right decisions. They're going to make some boneheaded decisions. They're going to make some stupid decisions. But every decision they make will be with your best interest at heart. It's your responsibility. Listen to this. It's not your responsibility to know why. It's not your responsibility to know all the ins and outs and all the moving parts that make that decision. One day you'll have the opportunity to make those same decisions. At this point in our life, it is simply enough to say, yes, I will listen to you. I'll do what you say. Why? Number one, he says, because this is right. This is the right thing to do. And then number two, he says, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Now, in the Decalogue, this was a promise given to Israel. Here it's not given to Israel. Here it's given not even to the community. It's given to us as individuals. So what's he saying? This is a very practical side of it. If you listen to your parents, they're going to keep you out of trouble. If you listen to your parents, they're going to keep you from getting hurt. How many of you did things as a kid? Activities out playing around. I'm not talking about, actually doing stuff to get in trouble, but you played in ways that you would never let your kids play. Because looking back, you realize how dangerous it was. Yep. I mean, you learn from those things. And then you stop and think, why wasn't my mom and dad watching me? David talks about it all the time. His mom and dad opening the door and letting them run, all the boys, and know that they'd be home in time for supper. And every time he tells that story, it makes me nauseous to think about opening the door and letting my kids just run. Because I sometimes get nervous with them running in the living room. And they're contained. So we've got this awesome responsibility. And he says, if you'll listen to your parents, he says, it'll be well with you. And your time on earth can be long. Number one, you'll have a relationship with God. And number two, you'll make wise decisions and you'll keep yourself from getting hurt. I'll ask another question. How many of you have made decisions against your mom and dad's best wishes, and you looked back later and said, I wish that I'd listened to mom and dad? Every one of us again. Do you see that, teenagers? Every one of us, if we could go back in time, would say, I'm going to listen to mom and dad. And at the end of your life, when I preach your mom and dad's funeral, assuming that I outlive them, I will not stand up and say they were perfect. And you won't want me to stand up and say they were perfect, because that would be a lie and everyone else would know that it's a lie. But what you will want me to say is they did their very best and I listened to them. Because this is where it all begins. If we want to honor our moms, it needs to be more than just one day a year. It needs to be a lifestyle of minding, a lifestyle of respecting, a lifestyle of obeying. Again, let me read this quote to you again and we'll be done. Honor is not about having a great childhood or about having a mom that got it all right. Honor is about gratitude and respect for the difficulty of the job. It's hard work being a parent. It is hard work being a parent. So, we owe our moms that respect because of the difficulty of the job. We also owe them that respect because God commanded it. This is your mom. Now, what makes this command so interesting in the Old Testament? A lot of times people look at the church and they'll say that we're anti-women and we want to put women, in the medieval ages and all that kind of stuff. In Deuteronomy, when God commanded Moses, this is what you're telling the folks. When he said, honor your father and mother, they were so far ahead of the rest of the world. Because moms were property. They were just baby factories. That's all they existed for. And yet God says, That's not the way it is with me. He says, honor your father and your mother. All right. So, there we go. This is something that we all have to put into practice. It never stops. When does it stop? My mom's still alive. I still have to honor her. Next week we'll talk. I'm seeing that transition in my life of where we'll get to next week, honoring our moms in their old age. Because the world changes, doesn't it? Some of us this morning need to ask our moms to forgive us for not obeying them the way we ought to. Some of us, it's too late for that. Mom's already gone. Can't see her this side of heaven. So how do you respond? Well, and you can't ask her for forgiveness, but you can ask God for forgiveness. And you can say, God, forgive me for not listening to my mom the way I was supposed to, because I realized that it was right for me to listen to her. And then you can follow that up with your children and have the relationship with them that you need to have so that they know how much you love them, they know how much they should trust you, and how much you have their well-being in mind. And show them from your mistakes. So here are the mistakes that I made because I didn't listen to my mom. Here are the mistakes I want you to avoid by listening to me.